If you can't afford it, maybe you shouldn't be buying it." The words landed louder than they should have, cutting through the low hum of scanners and conversations as Hannah Brooks froze at the checkout counter, her fingers trembling over a small pile of coins spread across the scratched plastic surface, the metallic clinks sounding far too sharp under the fluorescent lights as she counted again, slower this time, like somehow the numbers might change if she just gave them enough time. But they didn't. They never did. And behind her she could feel it. The weight of eyes, the impatience, the judgment, pressing against her back like something physical, something heavy, something she couldn't shake off no matter how straight she tried to stand, no matter how hard she tried to keep her voice steady as she whispered to the cashier, "I'm sorry, just give me a second." Her throat tight, dry, the words barely making it past her lips while the cashier sighed. Not cruel exactly, but tired. Already reaching for the next customer in her mind, already wishing this would be over. And somewhere behind Hannah a phone camera lifted, subtle but not subtle enough. A quiet click as someone decided this moment, her moment, was worth recording, worth sharing, worth turning into something for strangers to watch later. And Hannah felt her cheeks burn as she bent slightly, scooping up a quarter that had rolled dangerously close to the edge, her hair falling forward like a curtain she wished she could disappear behind, her heart pounding too fast, too loud. Like everyone could hear it, like everyone knew exactly how close she was to coming apart, and she swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus on the numbers. $1, 2, 3, still short, still not enough, and the woman behind her shifted again, louder this time, letting out an exaggerated breath. "Seriously?" she muttered, just loud enough for others to hear, just soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant to hurt. "There are people waiting," and a couple of quiet laughs followed, low, uncomfortable, but still there, still real, and Hannah's grip tightened around the can of baby formula sitting on the counter, her thumb brushing over the label like she could memorize it, like she needed to remind herself why she was here, why she couldn't just walk away, because back home, in a small apartment that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and sleepless nights, her baby girl was waiting, hungry, fussy, already struggling with a formula that made her cry for hours. This one, the expensive one, the one she could barely afford, was the only thing that helped, the only thing that let her sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. And Hannah blinked quickly, fighting the sting in her eyes as she pushed another coin forward, her voice even smaller now. "I think I'm almost there." But she already knew she wasn't. She could feel it in her chest, that sinking weight, that quiet panic starting to spread, and the cashier tapped the screen, glanced at the total, then back at the coins. "You're short $4.16, she said, not unkindly, just matter of fact. And for a second, everything went still, like the entire store had paused just to let that number settle in, just to let it echo, and Hannah's breath caught, her mind scrambling, replaying the numbers, trying to find a mistake that wasn't there, and behind her, a man who had been silent until now shifted slightly, the faint sound of polished shoes against tile barely noticeable to anyone else. But his gaze, steady, sharp, observant, hadn't left her since the first coin hit the counter. Adrian Cole stood just a step behind, hands relaxed at his sides, expression unreadable, taking in every detail, the worn edges of her coat, the way her shoulders tensed with every whisper behind her, the way she kept glancing at that single can like it mattered more than anything else in the world. And he said nothing, not yet, just watched, as Hannah hesitated, her fingers hovering over the items, her lips parting like she was about to speak, about to apologize, about to choose what to give up, because she knew what came next. She knew the routine, the quiet humiliation of deciding which necessities suddenly became optional. And as she drew in a shaky breath, the silence around her stretched just a little too long, just enough to make every second feel heavier than the last. Hannah's fingers hovered over the can for a second too long before she finally swallowed and reached for it, her hand unsteady as she slowly pulled it back toward herself, the motion small but impossible to hide. And the shift in the air around her was immediate, the quiet judgment sharpening into something louder, something bolder, as the woman behind her let out a short laugh. "There you go," she said, her voice carrying easily across the lane. Common sense finally kicked in, and another voice joined in from somewhere to the side. "It is always the same story. People want things they cannot afford. and Hannah felt every word like a weight pressing down on her chest, her shoulders curling inward despite her effort to stay composed. Her eyes fixed on the counter, as if looking up would make it worse, as if meeting their gaze would somehow confirm everything they were thinking, everything they were saying, and she forced herself to move, to separate the items, placing the formula aside with care while her other hand clutched the cheaper box she knew would not sit well with her baby, her throat tightening as she whispered, almost to herself, "It will be okay." Even though she did not believe it, not really, because she had seen what happened the last time, the crying, the sleepless hours, the helpless feeling of not being able to fix it, and the cashier cleared her throat softly, trying to keep things moving. "Ma'am, if you could just let me know what you are keeping." But Hannah hesitated again, her fingers brushing over the second item in her basket, a small bottle of fever medicine, the label slightly worn from being handled too many times without being bought. And for a moment, everything blurred together, the noise, the lights, the voices, until the only thing she could hear was the faint echo of her baby's cry from earlier that morning, the warmth of a tiny forehead pressed against her palm, hotter than it should have been, and her breath caught as she realized what she was being forced to choose between, food or medicine, comfort or necessity, and her hand tightened around the bottle before slowly lowering it back into the basket. Her lips parting as if to speak, but no words coming out, and behind her the impatience grew louder, a man muttering about being late, the woman with the phone angling it just a little closer, capturing every second of her hesitation, every flicker of emotion she could not quite hide, and Hannah blinked rapidly, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to decide, because there was no one else who was going to do it for her, no one else who was going to step in, no one else who cared enough to notice beyond the inconvenience she had become. And just as she finally drew in a breath to tell the cashier what to remove, a calm voice cut through the noise, low but unmistakably firm. "She is not removing anything." And the words did not rush, did not rise. They simply landed, steady and certain, and for a second the entire line went quiet, the kind of silence that does not come from politeness but from surprise. And Hannah froze, her heart stuttering as she slowly turned her head, not fully, just enough to catch a glimpse of the man behind her, tall, composed, his expression unreadable but his presence impossible to ignore. And before she could react, before she could protest, the faint sound of a card being placed on the counter followed, smooth and deliberate, like the decision had already been made long before she even realized what was happening. Hannah's breath caught as her eyes flicked from the card on the counter to the man standing behind her, her first instinct immediate and instinctive. "No, I cannot accept that," she said quickly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, her hand reaching toward the card as if she could somehow return the moment itself, undo what had just happened. But he did not move to take it back, did not even glance at her right away, his attention still on the cashier as he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Everything," he repeated calmly, and there was something in his tone that made the cashier straighten slightly, her fingers pausing for only a fraction of a second before she resumed scanning, this time with a different kind of care, the earlier impatience gone, replaced by something quieter, more cautious, as if the balance of the situation had shifted in a way no one wanted to challenge. And behind Hannah the murmurs faded, not completely, but enough to notice, the woman with the phone lowering it just a little, her expression changing from amusement to curiosity, as though the story she thought she was capturing had suddenly taken a turn she did not expect. And Hannah felt it all without fully looking, the subtle change in the air, the way the tension twisted into something else, something she could not quite name. And it made her even more uneasy, her fingers curling into her palm as she shook her head again, softer this time, but no less firm. "Please, I can put things back. I just need the formula," her voice dropping on the last word, almost breaking despite her effort to keep it steady. And for the first time he looked at her directly, his gaze steady, assessing, not unkind but not easily dismissed either. "Your baby needs more than just one thing," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear clearly, and the simplicity of it, the quiet certainty, made her hesitate, made her chest tighten in a way she did not expect, because he was not wrong, and she knew it. But knowing it did not make accepting help any easier, not from a stranger, not like this, not in front of everyone. and she swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the counter again as the final item was scanned. The total appearing on the screen, higher than she wanted to see, higher than she could ever manage on her own right now. And yet he did not react, did not question it, simply slid the card forward when the cashier prompted, the soft beep of the machine sounding almost too loud in the sudden quiet. And Hannah stood there, frozen between gratitude and discomfort, between relief and something dangerously close to shame, her heart still racing as she tried to make sense of it, to understand why someone would do this without hesitation, without even asking her name. And then the receipt. Printed, the paper curling slightly as it emerged, and the cashier placed it gently on the counter, her voice softer now, almost respectful. "You are all set." And for a moment Hannah did not move, her hand hovering uncertainly before she finally reached for the bag, the weight of it heavier than she expected, not just because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. And as she lifted it, her phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket, sharp and urgent, cutting through everything, and her heart jumped as she fumbled to pull it out, the screen lighting up with a name that made her stomach drop instantly, and she answered without thinking, her voice barely above a whisper, "Hello." And the response on the other end came fast, strained. "Hannah, you need to come home right now. She is burning up again. It is getting worse." And the world seemed to tilt slightly under her feet, her grip tightening on the phone as the words sank in, as the urgency replaced everything else, every thought, every hesitation, every attempt to hold herself together. And she closed her eyes for just a second, trying to steady her breath, knowing she needed to move, needed to leave, needed to get back as fast as possible. But even as she turned, her mind raced with one unavoidable question: how was she supposed to get there in time? The noise of the store rushed back all at once, but it felt distant now, muffled behind the pounding of Hannah's heartbeat as she lowered the phone slowly, her fingers tightening around it while the words echoed in her mind. Burning up again, getting worse. And for a split second, she just stood there, frozen between the counter and the exit, her thoughts scrambling to catch up with the urgency that had just crashed into her. Because nothing else mattered now, not the people watching, not the humiliation from minutes ago, not even the man standing beside her. Only the image of her baby lying there, too warm, too quiet, waiting for her. And she turned abruptly, the bag in her hand swinging slightly as she took a step toward the door, her voice coming out rushed and uneven as she spoke without looking back. "Thank you. I have to go." The words barely formed before she started moving, weaving past the end of the checkout lane, her pace quickening with every step, already calculating the distance in her head. 15 blocks, maybe a little more, the bus schedule flashing in her memory. The next one not for another 20 minutes at least, and 20 minutes felt like forever, felt like too much time she did not have, and she pushed through the sliding doors into the late afternoon air, the cool breeze hitting her face but doing nothing to steady the panic rising inside her chest, her eyes scanning the street automatically, searching for something, anything, a taxi, a ride, a solution that did not exist, cars passing by without slowing, people moving in their own directions, none of them noticing her, none of them aware that somewhere just a few miles away a small life depended on how fast she could get there. And she took another step forward, then another, already bracing herself to run if she had to, the weight of the bag shifting in her grip as she adjusted it against her side, her breathing shallow, uneven, and just as she was about to step off the curb, a voice came from behind her, steady, close enough to stop her without needing to be loud. "Hannah." And the sound of her name made her pause instinctively, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, her steps slowing as she turned slightly, confusion flickering across her face because she had not given him her name. She was sure of it. She would have remembered. And there he was again, the same composed presence from inside, already a few steps behind her, as if he had followed without hesitation, without question, his expression focused now, sharper than before, and she blinked, her breath catching as the realization settled in. "How do you know my name?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, her voice edged with both urgency and suspicion, because right now nothing made sense, not the help, not the timing, not the way he seemed to move through all of this like he already understood more than she did. and he did not answer right away, his gaze dropping briefly to the phone still clutched in her hand, then back to her face, reading the panic she could not hide, the fear she could not control. And when he spoke, his voice was calm but firm, leaving no space for hesitation. "You need to get home fast." And it was not a question, not an assumption. It was a statement. And for a moment she just stared at him, torn between everything she had learned about trusting strangers and the reality pressing in on her from all sides. The ticking clock she could almost hear, the distance she could not close on her own, and the next words came before she could fully decide, quiet but certain. "Come with me." And as he said it, a black car pulled up along the curb beside them, smooth and deliberate, the engine barely making a sound, the driver already stepping out, and Hannah's breath caught again, her eyes flicking from the car to him. The gap between who she thought he was and who he might actually be widening in a way that made her pulse race even faster, because this was no longer just help. This was something else entirely, something she did not understand yet. And standing there on the edge of the street, with seconds slipping away, she realized she had a choice to make, one that could change everything, one she did not have time to think through. Hannah's fingers tightened around the strap of the bag as she stood there for a fraction of a second too long, her instincts pulling her in opposite directions, one voice telling her this was too much, too sudden, too dangerous, and another louder, sharper voice reminding her that every second she wasted standing here was another second her baby was lying there burning with fever, waiting for her, needing her, and she swallowed hard, her eyes flicking once more to the car, the polished black surface reflecting the fading light. The driver standing by the open door with a quiet patience that felt practiced, like this was normal, like this kind of moment happened all the time in his world, and that alone made her hesitate again, because nothing about her life was like that. Nothing about her world moved this smoothly, this easily, and yet she could not ignore the urgency pressing against her chest. The memory of that voice on the phone, strained and worried, repeating in her mind, getting worse. And without allowing herself another second to think it through, she nodded once, quick and decisive, more to herself than to him, before stepping forward and sliding into the back seat, the leather cool against her skin, the interior quiet, almost too quiet compared to the noise she had just left behind, and she barely had time to settle the bag beside her before the door closed with a soft, solid click, sealing her inside as the driver returned to his seat, and the car began to move almost immediately, smooth and controlled, merging into traffic with an ease that felt unreal compared to the chaos still racing through her thoughts. And for a moment, she just sat there, her hands resting on her lap, her breathing uneven as she tried to process everything that had just happened. The shift from standing helpless at a checkout counter to sitting inside a car she knew she could never afford, driven by a man she did not know, beside another man who somehow knew her name. And the question came back to her, stronger now, impossible to ignore. "You still have not answered me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt as she turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes searching his face. "How do you know my name?" And this time he did not avoid it, did not deflect, his gaze meeting hers for a brief moment before shifting forward again, thoughtful, measured, as if choosing what to say. And when he finally spoke, his tone remained calm, but there was something beneath it now, something more deliberate. "It was on the receipt," he said simply, and for a second she blinked, the explanation so straightforward that it caught her off guard, her mind replaying the moment at the counter, the paper curling out, her name printed clearly at the top, and she exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing but not disappearing completely, because even if that answered one question, it did not explain everything else. The way he had acted without hesitation, the way he seemed to step into her situation like he belonged there, like he had been waiting for it. And she looked away, her gaze drifting to the window as the city passed by in a blur, streetlights beginning to flicker on, people moving along sidewalks unaware of the urgency inside this car, and she pressed her lips together, her thoughts shifting back to what mattered most. "It is 15 blocks from here," she said quickly, giving directions almost on instinct, her voice gaining urgency again. "Take a left at the next light, then straight down Maple. There is an old brick building near the corner." And the driver nodded without question, adjusting the route smoothly, and the car picked up speed just slightly, not reckless, Not rushed, but efficient, every movement controlled. And Hannah leaned back just enough to steady herself, her hands slipping into her bag for a moment, brushing against the bottle of medicine she had not had to leave behind, the weight of it grounding her in a way she did not expect. And for the first time since the phone call, a small, fragile sense of relief flickered through her chest, but it was quickly followed by another thought, quieter but just as persistent, because as the car moved forward and the distance to her home began to close, one question lingered, refusing to let go. If he had only seen her name on a receipt, then why had he said it like he already knew her? The city lights streaked past the window in long, blurred lines as the car moved steadily through traffic, and Hannah found herself gripping the edge of the seat without realizing it, her body still tense, still bracing as if something might go wrong at any second, because that was how her life had been lately, one thing slipping just when she thought she could hold it together, and she exhaled slowly, trying to match her breathing to the rhythm of the car, trying to calm the tightness in her chest, but her mind refused to settle, jumping between thoughts, her baby, the fever, the medicine in her bag, the man beside her, and that lingering feeling that something about all of this was not as simple as it should have been, and she turned her head slightly again, unable to ignore it any longer. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly, her voice softer now, but still carrying a weight that demanded an answer. Because people did not just step in like that, not without a reason, not without expecting something in return, and she had learned that the hard way. And for a moment he did not respond, his gaze fixed ahead as the car turned onto Maple, the streetlights casting brief flashes of light across his face, revealing a hint of something deeper behind his composed expression, something thoughtful, almost distant, and when he finally spoke, his tone was even, controlled, but not dismissive. "Because you needed help," he said, and the simplicity of it made her frown slightly, her fingers tightening again as she shook her head. "That is not a reason," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "People do not do that for no reason." And there was no accusation in her tone, just a quiet truth shaped by experience. And this time he glanced at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second, steady and unreadable, before shifting forward again. "Not everyone," he said, and the words lingered in the space between them, not quite an explanation, but not something she could easily dismiss either, and she looked away again, her gaze returning to the window as familiar streets began to appear, the worn brick buildings, the small corner stores, the flickering street lamp near the intersection she passed every day, and her heart started to race faster, anticipation mixing with fear as they drew closer, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice gaining urgency again. "It is the next building on the right," she said quickly, pointing ahead, "the one with the broken sign." And the driver slowed without hesitation, pulling the car smoothly toward the curb. And before it had even come to a full stop, Hannah was already reaching for the door handle, her movements quick, almost frantic, the bag slipping against her side as she pushed it open and stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cool air hitting her again as she barely paused, turning back just long enough to say, "Thank you." The words rushed, sincere but incomplete, because there was no time for anything else, and then she was moving, crossing the short distance to the building entrance, her hand fumbling slightly with the keys as she pushed the door open, and hurried inside, the familiar scent of the hallway wrapping around her, grounding her for a split second before the urgency took over again, her steps quick and uneven as she climbed the stairs two at a time, her breath catching in her throat with every step, until she reached her door and pushed it open, her voice already calling out, "I am here." And from inside, the sound of a weak, restless cry answered her immediately, pulling her forward, pulling her into the small apartment where everything that mattered waited, while outside, the black car remained parked at the curb, engine still running, and inside it, Adrian Cole did not look away from the building, his expression unchanged, but his eyes fixed on the door she had just disappeared through, as if he was not quite ready to leave yet. The door barely had time to close behind her before Hannah crossed the small space in 2 quick steps, dropping the bag onto the nearest surface as she moved straight toward the couch where a thin blanket had been hastily spread, and there, curled against a pillow too big for her tiny frame, was her baby girl, her cheeks flushed, her breathing uneven, a soft, restless sound escaping her lips that made Hannah's chest tighten instantly. Hey, hey, I am here, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly as she knelt down and reached out, her hand hovering for just a second before touching the small forehead. And the heat hit her immediately, stronger than before, undeniable, and her breath caught as a wave of fear surged through her, sharper now, more real, because this was no longer just a worry, it was right in front of her, and she carefully lifted the baby into her arms, cradling her close, feeling the warmth through the thin fabric, the slight weight that felt both fragile and heavy at the same time. "It is okay, sweetheart," she murmured, rocking gently without even thinking, her body moving on instinct, trying to soothe, trying to comfort, even as her mind raced through everything she needed to do: medicine, temperature, water, anything that might help bring it down. And from the small kitchen area, an older woman stepped forward, her expression tight with concern. "I tried calling again," she said quietly, her hands clasped together as she watched. "She has not settled at all. It keeps going up." And Hannah nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak right away as she adjusted the baby slightly, pressing her cheek against the small head for just a second, grounding herself, steadying her breathing, before she moved toward the counter, reaching for the bottle of medicine she had just brought, her hands still trembling but more focused now, more certain. "We are going to fix this," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else, and she measured out the dose carefully, double-checking without realizing she was doing it twice, then bringing it gently to the baby's lips, coaxing her to take it, whispering quietly the entire time, her voice low and steady despite everything. "Just a little bit. Come on. You are okay." And after a moment, the baby swallowed, weak but responsive, and Hannah let out a small breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders dropping just slightly as she continued to rock, her movements slower now, more controlled. But the worry did not leave. It lingered in every glance, every touch, every second she watched for a change that had not come yet. And behind her, the older woman moved closer, her voice softer now. "Do you need anything else? Should I call someone?" And Hannah shook her head gently, her eyes never leaving her child. "Let us wait a few minutes," she said, her voice steadier than before, but still carrying the edge of fear she could not fully hide. And the room fell quiet except for the soft sounds of breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator, the kind of silence that stretches when you are waiting, hoping, counting seconds without meaning to. And outside, through the small window near the door, the streetlight flickered faintly, casting a dim glow across the worn hallway beyond, where the black car was still parked at the curb, engine running, and inside it, Adrian Cole sat without speaking, his gaze fixed on the building as if he could see through the walls, as if he knew exactly what was happening inside, his fingers resting lightly against the armrest, unmoving, until, after a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice low but decisive. "Wait here." And before the driver could respond, he had already opened the door, stepping out onto the sidewalk with a quiet urgency that did not match his usual calm, his eyes lifting briefly toward the apartment window before he started toward the entrance. Because something in the way she had said thank you, something in the way she had held that child, had made it impossible for him to simply drive away. The seconds stretched in a way that made it impossible to tell how much time had actually passed, each one heavy, deliberate, as Hannah kept rocking gently, her eyes fixed on the small face in her arms, searching for any sign, any shift, any hint that the medicine was beginning to work. And for a moment nothing changed, the warmth still too strong, the breathing still uneven, and her chest tightened again, her fingers brushing lightly over the baby's hair as she whispered, "Come on, sweetheart. Stay with me." Her voice soft but strained, and just as she leaned closer, listening, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, followed by a quiet knock at the door, unexpected, out of place, and Hannah froze for a fraction of a second, her gaze lifting toward the entrance, confusion flickering across her face because she was not expecting anyone else. Not now. Not like this. And the older woman glanced toward the door as well, hesitant. "Should I get it?" she asked quietly. But Hannah was already shifting carefully, adjusting the baby in her arms as she stood, her movements slow but purposeful, every instinct telling her to stay close, to not move away, but something about the timing pulled at her, something she could not ignore, and she stepped toward the door, her heart still racing, her free hand reaching out to turn the handle. And when she opened it, the sight on the other side made her pause, just for a second, because he was standing there, the same composed figure from outside, but closer now, more real in the dim hallway light. And for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the faint sounds from inside the apartment. And then his gaze dropped slightly, drawn immediately to the child in her arms, his expression shifting in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, something sharper, more focused. And when he spoke, his voice was lower now, more direct. "How high is the fever?" he asked, and the question caught her off guard, not just because of what he was asking, but because of how he asked it, like it mattered, like he needed to know. And she blinked, her mind taking a second to catch up. "It was 103 earlier," she replied quickly, her voice still edged with worry. "I just gave her medicine." And he nodded once, his eyes not leaving the child, calculating, assessing, and then he stepped forward slightly, not crossing the threshold but close enough that his presence filled the doorway. "That is too high to wait," he said calmly, and there was no panic in his tone, no rush, just certainty, and it made her hesitate, her grip tightening just slightly as she instinctively held the baby closer. "The medicine needs time," she replied, almost defensively, because that was what she had been told, what she had read, what she was holding on to right now. And he met her gaze again, steady, unwavering. "And if it does not, come down," he said, his voice just as calm but firmer now. "You lose time you do not have." And the words settled heavily between them, not dramatic, not loud, but impossible to ignore. And for a second she just stared at him, her thoughts colliding, fear, doubt, instinct, all pulling in different directions. And behind her the older woman stepped closer, her voice uncertain. "Maybe we should take her in, just to be safe." And Hannah's breath caught again, the fragile sense of control she had been holding on to starting to slip, because she knew they were right. She knew waiting was a risk, but so was everything else. And she looked back down at her child, her thumb brushing gently across the flushed cheek, feeling the heat that had not yet faded. And when she looked up again, her voice was quieter, but no less urgent. "The hospital is 15 minutes away," she said, almost to herself. And before she could think further, before she could second-guess it again, he spoke, already, turning slightly as if the decision had been made. "Then we leave now." And the certainty in his voice left no room for hesitation, and standing there in the doorway, with everything on the line, Hannah realized she was about to trust him again, not because she wanted to, but because she had no better option. The hallway seemed narrower on the way out, the air tighter, heavier, as Hannah stepped through the doorway with her baby held close against her chest, the warmth still too strong, still wrong, and she adjusted her grip instinctively, one hand supporting the small head, the other wrapped protectively around her, as if she could shield her from everything simply by holding on tighter. And Adrian was already moving ahead, his pace controlled but urgent, glancing back just enough to make sure she was keeping up, his presence steady, grounding in a way she did not fully understand but could not ignore. And behind them the older woman called out softly, "Call me when you know something." But the words faded quickly as the door closed and the sound of their footsteps echoed down the stairwell, each step faster than the last, Hannah's breathing uneven, her focus locked on one thing only, getting there in time. And when they pushed through the building entrance, the cool night air hit her again, sharper now, and the car was already waiting. The door opened before they even reached it, the driver standing ready, and everything moved quickly after that, too quickly for her to process, as she slid into the back seat, cradling her baby carefully, Adrian following immediately, the door closing with that same quiet finality. And within seconds the car was moving, faster this time, not reckless but decisive, weaving through traffic with a precision that made it clear the driver had done this before. And Hannah leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving the small face in her arms, watching for any change, any sign, her thumb brushing gently across the flushed cheek again and again, as if the motion itself might bring the fever down. "Stay with me," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible, her heart racing with every second that passed. And beside her Adrian reached forward slightly, speaking to the driver in a low voice, giving instructions that were calm but unmistakably urgent, and the city lights blurred even more as they picked up speed, the distance closing faster now. And for a moment there was only the sound of the engine and her quiet whispers, until she felt it, something subtle, something small, a shift in the way the baby's breathing sounded, less strained, just slightly, and her breath caught as she leaned closer, her fingers pressing gently against the forehead again, and it was still warm, still too warm, but not quite as intense as before, and she exhaled slowly, a fragile sense of relief breaking through the fear, not enough to stop, not enough to change course, but enough to hold on to for the next few minutes. And she closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, grounding herself in that tiny change, before opening them again, her gaze lifting without meaning to, landing on him. And he was watching her, not the road, not the city, but her, his expression unchanged yet focused in a way that made her pause. And for a moment the urgency faded just enough for another question to rise, quieter but heavier than before, because none of this made sense. Not the way he had stepped in, not the way he had followed her, not the way he was still here. And she swallowed, her voice low but steady despite everything. "You could have left," she said, the words simple but loaded. And he held her gaze for a brief second before responding, his tone calm, almost certain. "I do not leave things unfinished." And the answer lingered, vague but intentional, and before she could respond, before she could press further, the car slowed slightly, turning into the brightly lit entrance of the hospital, the emergency sign glowing ahead, and everything shifted again, the focus snapping back to what mattered most as the car came to a stop and the driver was already opening the door, and Hannah moved immediately, stepping out with careful urgency, her grip tightening once more as she rushed toward the entrance, not looking back, not stopping, while behind her Adrian stepped out as well, his gaze following her for a fraction of a second, before lifting toward the building ahead, his expression sharpening just slightly, because this was no longer just about helping a stranger at a checkout line. This was something else now, something that had already begun to unfold in a way neither of them had expected. And as Hannah disappeared through the hospital doors, one thought remained, quiet but impossible to ignore, because somewhere between a name on a receipt and this moment, something about her had made him stay, and he had not yet said why.